Hi, this is John Potter and welcome to session 6 of Leadership in Action. And in this session we're going to have a look at effective change leadership.
In Module 6 we're going to have a look at a very important aspect of leadership, and that is effective change leadership. And we're going to look at effective change leadership from a number of viewpoints. We're going to think about the reasons why we get change and the sources of change, whether change is internally driven or externally imposed. We'll have a look at the way organisations are going to respond to change, the way individuals respond, and some ideas on how to lead change effectively. In Module 6 we're going to have a look at a very important aspect of leadership, and that is effective change leadership. And we're going to look at effective change leadership from a number of viewpoints. We're going to think about the reasons why we get change and the sources of change, whether change is internally driven or externally imposed. We'll have a look at the way organisations are going to respond to change, the way individuals respond, and some ideas on how to lead change effectively. Slide 2 starts us thinking about the way the world has changed, particularly in the last 20 or so years. Now, change has always been part of our world, but it does seem as though there's been an acceleration of change, and that change is almost becoming exponential. And so, although it's rather artificial, it's useful to set a point at which we start to think about change becoming really significant. And I would argue that our life has changed dramatically since 1990 because of a whole host of factors in slide 2. Firstly, we've seen the end of the Cold War. There is no east-west wall. For many years we were very paranoid about this east-west balance with guided missiles and all sorts of spying going on, but that all finished at the late 1980s time, and now since 1990 of course we've integrated across the borders between the East and the West. The downside of that is, in those pre-1990 days, we did have one obvious enemy, and there was a lot of propaganda about disliking the Russians, disliking the East and all the rest of it. However, our problem today is that we don't have obvious enemies across the water or in different countries quite so much. What we seem to be seeing is a kind of an emergence of enemies from within, the so-called threat of Al-Qaeda and terrorism and all these sorts of things, which I believe have raised our level of social anxiety and forced particularly a lot of public sector organisations, particularly transport and government departments, to actually greatly increase the security in which we have to live. And it's much more complex now flying anywhere or going on a train or even going on the tube, because the whole question of security has become vital. It's one of the reasons that drives the fact that we have so much video surveillance, so many cameras around. And of course one of the most significant things that's happened in the last 20 years has been the emergence of the Internet, 3 magic letters, the World Wide Web. And both the media and the web has raised our awareness of world poverty, many things like AIDS, bird flu and so on and so forth. And we're also becoming more aware of climate change, global warming, and all the whole carbon footprint issue has become very important in people's minds, and all sorts of organisations are having to take those things seriously. Another key thing that has changed is our focus on the sustainability of resources. And then there's the power of the media and the way we as individuals communicate. Cell phones, they were not really very prevalent before 1990. In fact, we talked about them as house bricks. They were so big and so heavy and not really very effective. We now have very small digital phones, tri-band, multi-band, they work all over the world. We have smartphones, Blackberries, iPods and so on. And those elements of technology are actually causing quite considerable change in the way we think about teaching people. Global and satellite television. Satellite television particularly has expanded so that we have in many countries literally hundreds of channels. And of course third world countries can now see the way other countries live, and that raises their hopes, their aspirations and probably their expectations of what they deserve in their life. Information and communication technology, very, very important. ICT, as we call it. We used to just call it IT. We now call it ICT to reflect the fact it is communication technology that has moved forwards. And many of our lives are driven by email and voicemail systems. In fact, it's often quite rare now to ring a large organization and find you speak to a human being. It's so often press 1 if you want this, press 2 if you want that. For many people, that raises their stress level. The reducing cost of international travel by air. Air has ceased to be a sort of glamorous way of travelling for many people, and of course in the year 2010 we had the problem of the ash cloud from the volcano in Iceland. We had 9/11 several years ago, which raised people's fears about travelling by air. We've seen the emergence of the cut price airlines and so on and so forth. Now, what the outcome of this reducing cost of travel by air is that many people have travelled much more in the last 20 or 30 years than they would have done previously because of the reducing cost of air travel. They see how other people in the rest of the world live, and they find that their expectations, their levels of aspiration are obviously often increased because they want what other people have got. And of course in the last 2-3 years we've seen tremendous instability in the global financial markets, organisations having to downsize, focus on added value, and this search for everlasting added value search is very, very important because it really is one of the prime jobs of the leader. How can you do things more efficiently and more effectively? And there's lots and lots of other things. So, just putting that lot together and taking the overview, it seems that our thoughts on leadership also started to evolve around this 1990 time. And this was really, I think, a response to some of the major changes at the political, social, technological and other levels. As we've said, the East-West Wall was dismantled and our enemies were no longer clearly defined, and the Internet and the digital world was underway, such as increasing awareness of the changes that we actually have in our world. And this massive set of change issues caused many organisations to find it was difficult to go about their business in the same way as they'd done in the past, that levels of stress within the organisation were increasing rapidly, and society is becoming increasingly cynical about the motives of many large corporate bodies. In addition, thought on leadership was developing, particularly as a result of Peter Senge at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, i.e. MIT, in the USA, and Senge proposed that the leader's new role was more related to building capacity by unlocking human potential than what had happened in the past, which was about commanding and controlling the people within the organisation. This new and altered view of leadership is particularly relevant to the role of the team leader in terms of putting leadership into action. So before moving on to the next slide, just give the following study questions some thought. What factors can you identify which have affected the way your organisation works? Secondly, how effectively has your organisation handled those factors? Just give some thought to those questions before moving on to the next slide. In slide 3, we're going to be looking at the drivers of change, the reasons why change seems to have to take place. And these drivers, again, may come from within the organisation, what we call internal drivers, or they may be externally imposed. Now, if we actually take a reductionist view of change, then it's often argued that it's a multivariate effect of 3 issues. Firstly, there are more people in the world with more ideas. Secondly, the advances in technology are changing the nature of work. And thirdly, everyone is being bombarded with more information than ever before. Well, that's a fairly big high chunk umbrella view of change, and it's not really particularly helpful if we want to be really serious about analysing the true drivers in a given organisation. A more detailed approach to the drivers of change investigates the combination of a number of factors. Often we talk about political, economic, environmental, social, technological, legal and other issues. And this has led to the creation of a sort of shorthand of change diagnosis models. ways that we can actually diagnose those particular reasons or drivers for change. The most commonly used one seems to be what we call PEST, and PEST stands for political, economic, social and technological in most cases, although sometimes people do vary the meanings of the words. They might use, for example, environmental instead of economic and so on. So PEST is a very common one, and there are more complex derivatives, including specific variables which are useful for an individual organisation, and two of those that come to mind are PESTLE and IPISL. And they are just two examples. PESTLE obviously talks about economic, political, information, social, technological, legal and environmental changes, for example, although again the characters can actually vary. So it's about an organisation working out which group of drivers are actually going to be the most useful. So our study questions for this slide are as follows. What are the drivers of change in terms of your organisation which would create your IPISL framework of economic, political, information, social, technological, legal and environmental change drivers? How can you relate this to your operation as a leader in your organisation in terms of putting leadership into action? In slide 4 we move on to look at how organisations tend to respond to change, and in particular we introduce an interesting metaphor which we call the change house. Now organisations clearly do respond to change in a number of ways. Often we see downsizing, sometimes we talk about right-sizing, we talk about outsourcing, and all these words which have made up the business language of the last few years are all ways of trying to describe how the organisation adapts, a little bit like a living organism adapts to changes in its environment. And the change house is quite a useful idea. It's a metaphor to describe the stages of response to change which organisations tend to make or go through. And in the real world, no organisation is just in one room. For example, the sales department may be in renewal, finance may be in confusion, although we hope not, and research and development might be in denial about change. And so different attitudes often occur in different parts of the organisation. And there are well-defined behavioural and language indicators to suggest which room a particular of the organisation finds itself in at a current time. And the following slide actually shows the 4 main rooms in the change house. This model was actually created in conjunction with Ashridge Management College, and you can find out quite a lot about it by a Google search. But the following slide will show you the 4 main rooms in the change house, and the model can be actually expanded quite conveniently, and we often see conservatories added or loft extensions, basements and so forth. And these are all desired or used to actually make specific points about individual organisations. So, in which room or rooms would you suggest the various parts of an organisation with which you are familiar actually exists? Is your organisation in contentment? Is it in denial? Is it in perhaps confusion or renewal? And we'll look at these in a bit more detail after you've had a go at that study question, just working out which of those 4 rooms, contentment, denial, confusion or renewal, you think an organisation that you're familiar with actually exists. In slide 5 we see the change house as a diagram. We can see that there are 4 primary rooms, as we've already mentioned. The contentment room is where the organisation is content with its performance and somewhat self-congratulatory in terms of both what it says and what it does. They often celebrate past histories and past successes. Now when change starts to bite, then the denial phase tends to be entered, where key individuals in the organisation often refuse to accept that the change has any importance to the organisation and perhaps that it may be ignored. However, change does inevitably bite, and the organisation then enters the confusion stage, where knee-jerk reactions often take place, consultants are hired, blame is apportioned, headcount reduced, and task force teams created to sort out the mess. Now hopefully all that effort is rewarded and the organisation then enters the renewal phase, where it tackles the situation in a very productive way, sets goals and starts to reinvent itself. The danger is, of course, that when the situation improves, the organisation then slips back into contentment and the whole cycle starts again. Now teams and departments can also display this phenomenon of the change house, and the team and operational leaders need to be able to focus the work of their people towards the renewal phase as much as possible, acknowledging that the three other phases have their purpose but need to be passed through relatively rapidly. So, moving on to our study question, what behaviours and language do you feel would be apparent in each of the 4 rooms of the change house? Now, many people have sought to find out what works in terms of change leadership. In particular, my colleague Alan Hooper and I carried out some research in the late 1990s to find out what works in practice. And we found 5 factors that were important: creating understanding, communicating effectively, releasing the potential in your people, setting a good personal example, and not trying to do too much change at the same time. So let's have a look at these factors in a little bit more detail. Now, we set out to carry out our research on a global basis to find out how successful change leaders operate in order to enable their organisations to rise to the challenge of change. And we published our findings in 2000, however they still seem to be relevant to this day. And our book, Intelligent Leadership: Creating a Passion for Change, is still used as a working text for handling change effectively. Now, we interviewed some 26 senior managers and leaders in organisations around the world. We went to London, we visited New York, Los Angeles, Sydney, Cape Town, and a number of other locations, and a clear picture emerged which seemed to be consistent whichever part of the world was involved. And the most important issue is that the leader needs to create understanding about the need for change. Secondly, those needs must be communicated clearly to all involved in the organisation. The third issue is to work in such a way as to unlock the contributions of everyone in the organisation, capitalising on unlocking their potential and involving everyone in creating a compelling future. Setting a good personal example is important, particularly in behavioural terms and in terms of working consistently according to agreed values. That's very important. Finally, it's important not to attempt too much change at the same time in order to avoid people becoming swamped with challenge and infected by what we sometimes called initiativitis. So before moving on to the next slide, just give some thought to the following study questions. How well are the 5 issues in our book Intelligent Leadership handled in your organisation? And secondly, with regards to your team, how can you address these issues to help your team manage more effectively? In slide 7, we look at a very effective tool for change leadership, what we call force field analysis. This is based on some work many years ago by Kurt Lewin when he looked at this whole business of forces acting on people. Key tool then, which is highly effective, is force field analysis, and the principle of force field analysis is that both the present position and the desired future position are both defined as clearly as possible. We can see in the slide the present position where we have driving forces already pushing the position towards where we'd like it to be, but we have restraining forces that stop that movement taking place. So a sort of dynamic equilibrium is set up, and the person or the individual or the organisation stays in exactly the same place. So the range of factors or driving forces can actually be identified and quantified if possible to the degree of strength that's involved in them, and those issues restraining the progress are similarly identified and hopefully quantified. Now the same process can be carried out for the desired future position, and the actions required now are to identify which of the restraining forces in the present position may be reduced or eliminated in order to promote the required shift created by the driving forces in the present situation. Now this is sometimes seen as a counterintuitive process because many organisations prefer to step up pressure on the driving forces in the present position, believing that they will move things forwards. However, in practice this simply sets up more restraining forces in many cases, and it's often termed the RC factor, resistance to change. So our study questions this time are all about trying to apply force field analysis. Can you identify a situation, a change situation, which you have to lead? Can you isolate the driving and restraining forces for both the present and the desired future positions? Which of the restraining forces in the present situation could you reduce? Let's have a go at those study questions before you move on from this slide. Now when we lead people through transition, for example, removing some of these restraining forces or trying to get people to try different things, we actually are leading people through quite a complex transition. Another way of thinking about that force field diagram, which we had the present position and desired future position, is to look at the space in between the current state and the desired state. When people are led through change between those two states, it's not a simple process. In moving from their current state to the desired state, they're required to change many aspects of the way they function. And these include their current thinking, their behaviours, adding to their knowledge, their beliefs about their work, reassessing their values, challenging their assumptions, and even their identity. And it's a challenging task for leaders, and change leaders in particular, at all levels, but one which cannot be ignored. So, study questions this time. Can you identify an individual who you feel is in a change situation? And can you make an assessment of their current mindset in terms of the 7 factors quoted in the slide? That is, their current thinking, their behaviours, their knowledge base, their beliefs, particularly any negative beliefs they have, what's important to them, their values, what sort of assumptions do they make about the work, and are you risking challenging their identity in a way that they will not be comfortable with? So what steps could you take to help them transition from their current state in terms of those 7 issues to a state which would be more beneficial to them? Just have a go at those questions, give them some thought before moving on to the next slide. Moving on to slide 9, let's have a look at the human reactions to change. These often really set up the major leadership challenge. Now when faced with change, individuals as well as organisations tend to pass through certain stages. We've seen the stages of the change house related to organisations. Now let's have a look at the stages relating to individuals. Now considerable psychological research has been carried out into this area, and much of it related to traumatic incidents such as grief, rape, loss, being kidnapped or taken hostage, and then accidents, those accidents particularly which have caused major physical injury. The so-called response stage profile has been adapted to the change situation, which many psychologists will term a minor trauma, a trauma with a small t. Initially, the individual is unaware of the proposed change, and how the change is announced is very important in terms of avoiding this small t trauma. The first response to the change is usually denial. That is, the notion that the change does not affect them. However, when reality dawns, then resistance tends to set in, and initially this may be passive, but it may well become active. One of the keys to effective change leadership is to help the individual explore new ways of working related to the change in a safe environment, thus creating small building blocks of success. Once these building blocks aggregate to form a critical mass, then the individual will be won over to the change and able to consolidate their activity, finally becoming committed. So before moving on to the next slide, give some thought to the following study questions. Can you identify a change situation where you or others have experienced these 7 phases? How was each stage handled? Was the change leadership shown to be effective? How committed did those become to the change, those people who are involved? How committed did they really come to the change, or were they simply compliant? So just give some thought to those study questions before moving on to the next slide. Now in slide 10 we can see an abbreviated model of the personal reactions, and this model has direct application for the leader in a change situation, and this slide is a very easy way of reminding ourselves what we need to do to help individuals cope with change. Even if they're not small t traumas, change still is demanding. Now the 7 stages are reduced to 4 in this diagram. We see denial, resistance, exploration and commitment. Just the same principles as in the previous slide are operating. Initially the change is seen as external to the individual so they can push it away. However, the change starts to take hold. Individuals may then well internalize the change, seeing it as a personal threat to their status quo. The job of the change leader is to move across the boundary from the resistance to the exploration phase, recognizing that the individual is almost certainly feeling vulnerable and lacking in confidence. By handling carefully and creating small successes, the individual can work towards developing commitment and then externalizing that commitment by telling others about the benefits of the change. So this is a shorthand version, a shorthand graphical version of the phases of change that we've already seen in the earlier slide. So before moving on, just give the study questions some thought. Can you apply this approach to someone you know is resisting change? How can you move them to the exploration phase? What specific steps can you take to move them onwards towards commitment? In slide 11, we move back to the organisational level of change. Now, change can be organic and grown gently, or it can be sudden and, for many people in that case, quite traumatic. So one of the things we look for in terms of effective change leadership is a structured way of trying to win over hearts and minds, particularly those 5 factors that we looked at in the earlier slide when we talked about intelligent leadership, creating a passion for change. Now, one of the most useful models is that by Professor John Kotter from the Harvard Business School. Moving towards this bigger picture and the team as a whole rather than just individuals within the team, this model of change proposed by John Kotter of Harvard University in America has gained a great deal of popularity. It's been used successfully by many organizations both in the public and the private sectors. Kotter's argument is that it's important to create a sense of urgency. We need to have a group of people to drive the change through the organization rather than just relying on individual efforts. It's important that a strong shared vision is created and communicated throughout the organization, preferably with people being involved in the creation and acceptance of that vision. People need to feel empowered to make changes in the areas in which they are involved. And it's also essential to obtain some quick wins to support the concept and rationale of the change program. And those quick wins need to be consolidated and used to produce more change. Finally, the new approaches need to be institutionalized so that people use the new approaches automatically, willingly and without resistance. So, the study questions for this slide: can you identify a change situation which you can lead effectively with John Kotter's 8 steps? Where would these 8 steps be useful? How will you go about implementing these steps? How will you assess the extent to which you have been successful? So give those questions some thought before moving on to the last slide, which is about the bibliography. In the bibliography slide, slide 12, it's worth mentioning 4 texts that are useful. Firstly, Intelligent Leadership, Creating a Passion for Change does talk through a very pragmatic way of leading people through change with 5 clearly identified factors. A little bit earlier than that, John Cotter from Harvard had produced A Force for Change, and he comes up with a number of very good, very structured ideas of handling effective change leadership situations. Now, John Katzenbach, a consultant with McKinsey's, has come up with a very useful concept of real change leaders, those people who are in the middle of the organisation who handle change effectively. And he comes up with a number of factors which are quite interesting. So a Google search on John Katzenbach and real change leaders will probably come up with some useful information for you. The book has the whole story. And then going right back to 1984, Rosabeth Moss-Kanter wrote a very, very useful book which is still highly relevant sort of 25 years on, and that is The Change Masters. Some of the things that organisations do to screw up change are still happening in this very day. So have a look at some of the books, and I'll look forward to speaking with you in the next session. That's the end of session 6.